Hello. In the Crown of Aragon 639 years ago, it was April 13th, 1387. My name is Jonathan Seyfried. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico, and this is the Historian's Notebook, a podcast about how history gets made. Season 1 is titled Multcara Companiona. We're looking at a document from each day of the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violant de Bar. Let's begin today's document. Today's document was really challenging paleographically, and also there's a lot of worm damage to it. And so when I opened up the OpenClaw pipeline transcription, I wasn't all that surprised to see that it was basically useless. So there's definitely a limit to what can be produced without human intervention when the paleography is challenging, when it is in Latin, and when there is damage to the paper. So in those circumstances, it is almost not even worth it for me to open up the document that OpenClaw saved to my computer for that particular folio. I mean, I'm still kind of curious to see if there's ever like a breakthrough, but if you look at the image of the folio for which this document dated April 13th is in the center, well, you'll see it's a rough looking piece. And then furthermore, the scribe did some things to letter forms and abbreviations that make it, I mean, it's not like the most challenging paleographically that I've seen, but there is a lot going on that makes it tough. And so as I was reviewing what was generated through the automated process using OpenClaw, I, after just a couple minutes, said, yeah, this is just not even worth looking at. And I went back to my former routine of using Gemini and Claude together, one by one. And then at the end of that, it wasn't all that much superior. So I then supplied Claude with some transcription of my own. And I transcribed probably half of this document. And not really like just the first half, but I tried to hone in on the places where Claude had struggled the most. And in the end, I think I got to a point where the meaning of this document I can be like 85% sure of, and there are still a lot of questions. However, this particular document is not one of those Latin documents that have sometimes been the episodes on the podcast where I just kind of grumble a little while about how difficult Latin is and then say, well, this doesn't have anything to do with my research question. This one is a Latin document that actually does involve my research question about the extent to which Joan and Violant were co-ruling, or maybe in certain moments when Joan was ill, Violant was the one in charge of this kingdom. So the first tip-off to me is the fact that in the first line, the mention of Joan is there at the end. Johannes Dei Gracia Aragon Rex. Joan, by grace of God, King of Aragon. Oh, and I just noticed a faint little macron above Aragon in order to indicate some kind of declension of that noun. So the letter itself involves some kind of mention of Joan, and so I wanted to dig deeper, and along with the assistance of Claude, I was able to really get a lot of the meaning out of this, at least to a provisional extent. So I'll first go over what I'm pretty sure about, and then I'll talk about the parts of this document that I don't know about. First of all, let's talk about the addressee. The addressee line is supplied at the lower left below the main text block of the letter. It reads Delecto nostro Tristan de Pucliomonte. And then there's a little damage to the papers. This is difficult, but I think the surname is something like Pucliomonte or Pucliomonte. And then after that we have Sedis Pamplinonen. And then the next word, which is a line below, Hospitalario. So I think that this letter is addressed to a hospitaller, and a hospitaller that is located in Pamplona. Now, Pamplona is not inside the territory of the Crown of Aragon. It is in Navarre. It's the capital of Navarre, actually, if I've got that right. And so Violant is writing to somebody who is not inside the Crown of Aragon, but it seems pretty clear to me from reading that I've done that the Hospitallers have a special relationship with the Crown of Aragon. I haven't quite figured it out exactly, but I do know that the head of the Hospitallers, Francisco Fernandez de Heredia, is a frequent correspondent of both Joan and Violant, and one of the major sources of their supply of literature and translations of ancient texts, the Greek and Roman texts that they like to read. And so there is some kind of special connection. I can't figure out if the Crown of Aragon was like the major monarchical power that supported the Hospitallers. I think that might be the case. Remember that the Hospitallers are the military order that is most prominent in the Mediterranean at this time, because we are in the century that follows the destruction of the Knights Templar. So a lot of the property of the Knights Templar was handed over, transferred, forced into the possession of the Knights Hospitaller. And so this really is the prominent military order. And so I think that here what we can see is that Violant is basically writing in favor of an individual to take over a certain position in, I think, Pamplona, and is basically doing another one of these recommendation letters, but this one has a little bit of a twist. So, all right, that was the addressee. Let's talk about what makes this letter different. First of all, the way it starts is with the Latin word dudum. The Latin word dudum means a while ago or formerly. So right away, we've got something different about this document. It's not the kind of thing we usually see. And then as we get into the line, I really misinterpreted this at the beginning because I'm so used to seeing the initial words like benissimus, beatissimus, magnificus, like what we see here, serenissimus, something like the most benevolent, the most serene, the most magnificent. I'm usually used to seeing those words described as an attribute of the person that the letter is being written to. Like if it's being written to the Pope, it'll start out with words like that. But the fact that we have dudum here at the beginning then clued me into how the first two lines of this letter are all basically saying, a while ago, Joan, the king of Aragon, wrote to you. So all of that Benissimus and Magnificus, that is to describe Joan. And one of the real challenges of this first line in terms of really understanding the grammar of medieval Latin is that there is a wormhole that occurs in the little word right after princeps. And that makes it so that it's, I think, day, like DE, but it could also be, well, now that I'm looking at it, I think it's more AC, AC. AC means and also, and so it would kind of make sense like the greatest, most magnificent, the most beneficent prince, and then we've got Dominus Dominus. I don't know why we doubled the Dominus. I think something like it could be Lord of Lord. Yeah, I don't know why there are two Dominuses there. But then in the next line, we have a Latin version of Molt car Signor. We've got this vir nostra precarissimus et nos utique in favorem delecti nostri. So basically all that is to say, our most precious husband and also most favored something, and also most favored husband. I mean, the way that the Latin works, you can kind of backtrack into the earlier noun with these later phrases that describe that earlier noun. And so I almost think, actually, now that I'm looking at it, I think that favorem is the end of the sentence and delecti is the beginning of the next sentence, because that is a very large D. It's still lowercase, but it's large. All right. So I'm going to take out delecti from the sentence, the first sentence of the letter. Oh, and by the way, was it just yesterday, maybe it was the day before, that we were talking about a scribe that had gotten fancy with the letter D in datum at the end of a letter and had made it like a letter O? Well, that is helpful for understanding the shape of the letter D that begins this letter, that begins line 1. So if you look back at dudum, it looks like a big letter S, and then there's like 4 decorative dots in the middle there, but it's a D. So if you're used to seeing the letter D written as sort of looking like an O, then you'll recognize this word as dudum. Yeah, this particular document is pretty funny with the letter D because of the variation. If you look at the probata, you've got a capital D that looks more like what we would recognize in modern orthography as the capital D, but it still also has like a little twirly coming off the top that makes it reminiscent of a big S and kind of takes it back to the shape at the beginning of the first line. And then if you look at the dating clause, which starts at the end of the second to the last line, datum Barcinone is the end of that line. And look at that D. That is, you can almost see like the transformation of the shape of the letter D, and notice how it goes from this Gothic D, or I guess maybe this, oh gosh, my paleographical terminology is failing me right now, but I think this is like, oh, I don't even want to say what kind of D this is. It's like a very noticeable D shape in a stage of paleography that you can, as you learn paleography, you like start to look for particular letters and their shapes to indicate. Oh, I wish I could. Oh gosh, I'll put it in the webpage for the episode, so that those who are interested in paleography can get a kick out of the full explanation of this letter D and how it calls to mind all these different styles of script and the progression of scripts through time. All right, now we have a pretty clear idea of the beginning lines of this letter. Violant is saying to this Tristan, this hospitaller Tristan, that Joan had written to him. Joan had written to him about the support of a particular person for some post in the Knights Hospitaller unit that is around Pamplona. Now, what gets super confusing is that it seems that there are two names mentioned. It seems like there is someone in the end of the second line named something like Pascasi Servano. And then maybe even there might be another part of the name. Okay. And then we also have somebody else in line 4. Looks to me like a Bernardo abbreviation, and then a most definite pair, de Castellario. So we've got two people mentioned. I can't quite figure out for sure who is being advocated for here. I'm pretty sure that it's the first person, Pascasio Servano, but I don't want to be 100%. I don't want to state that with 100%. But it does seem like, and I don't know what the Bernardo Pair de Castellario is doing in this letter, but it does seem like what had happened is that Joan had written in favor of Pascasio Servano, and that for some reason Tristan, the person to whom this letter is addressed, had decided not to do what Joan wanted. And there's a word that really is a different one for the tone here than what we usually see, and it's on line 6 at the very beginning, dedecus. That is a very clear dedecus, even though the first letter is cut off by the repair paper that has been pasted over. Pretty sure it's dedecus, Dedecus, and if it is, there's really only one meaning of that. It is disgrace. And so here Violant is scolding. She's saying, you didn't promote or hire this person that Joan had told you to, and instead you delayed, and now I want you to actually do it. That is pretty much the meaning of this letter, to my understanding at this time. And so we've got a scolding tone, and we also have Violant picking up where Joan had left off. And it's really interesting because you might think, oh, the queen would first ask and then people might be less inclined to comply, and then the king would step in and get compliance. Because when we're thinking about a patriarchal society, we think, oh, who's going to be not listened to? It's probably the woman, and then the man comes in with male authority and then gets compliance. But what we're seeing here is that Joan was not listened to, and Violant steps in and is expecting compliance. So that's an interesting reversal. And I think that when I am refining my argument about gender roles and Joan and Violant and some unexpected things, some atypical choices, I think this letter really might be a nice piece of evidence to support that argument that there was some non-conformity going on in the gendered expressions of this king and queen. But in order to really use this document, I would really have to be solid in my understanding of the Latin. So at this time, in the notebook, we're just flagging this particular document as one that could be important. And then when I come back and I'm doing more of a collation of my research and deciding about what I'm going to argue and how I'm going to do it, then at that stage I would go and make a more solid transcription and translation of this document, and then be able to use it in my scholarly argumentation. So that is, I think, a really good example of the process overall and where this stage of the research fits into it. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Historian's Notebook, Season 1, Multcara Compagnona. If you are leaving with more questions than you arrived with, I've done my job. Because remember, the motto of The Historian's Notebook is dissatisfaction guaranteed. So, for example, you might be wondering, who are these people in this letter? I did a little bit of a search. Actually, I had Claude do it. Nothing really came up. So, we'll see if we can figure out a little bit more about them in the future. But for now, lots of questions. Of course, that's how it goes. Visit the website to see an image of today's document and eventually additional show notes. And listen again tomorrow to hear about the next day in the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violant de Bar. In the meantime, take care.